Okay, Ms. Cross, Mr. Jemison, whenever you're ready, let me know.
We can start now.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, conference participants. We're very excited to have a moment to have a conversation with Frank Jemison on his One Teacher's Reckoning. He and I had a conversation, and hopefully you've had a chance to view it. And now we have an opportunity for you to ask him some questions and engage with him around his experience as a teacher. Frank, any opening remarks you'd like to make before the questions start coming in?
One question I had, I think it's more just, I just was wondering, have participants seen the video yet, or are they watching it now? I wasn't sure.
It was my understanding that they've seen it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to be able to conduct an interview with Frank Jemison about his experience teaching in Memphis. Thank you, Frank, for being willing to do this.
Thank you.
Will you start off by telling us a little bit about what led you into education?
Well, I grew up in Memphis and wanted to come back. And when I first came back and got into education, I really viewed it as kind of part of the mission to close the achievement gap and things like that, that I felt that there was a kind of large cosmic social justice issue that I wanted to be a part of. It was rather abstract at first. But I also always had just a passion for children and for being around children. And so those two things combined really led me to feel strongly called to teach.
So you've kind of already started talking about the second question, and that really is, what was your vision for teaching like? You know, what did you think it would be like?
What I thought it was going to be like, it was definitely different than I thought it was going to be. It was harder than I thought it was going to be, certainly during my first couple of years. But
Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to be able to conduct an interview with Frank Jemison about his experience teaching in Memphis. Thank you, Frank, for being willing to do this.
thank you.
Will you start off by telling us a little bit about what led you into education?
Well, I grew up in Memphis and wanted to come back. And when I first came back and got into education, I really viewed it as kind of part of the mission to close the achievement gap and things like that, that I felt that there was a kind of large cosmic social justice issue that I wanted to be a part of. It was rather abstract at first. But I also always had just a passion for children and for being around children. And so those two things combined really led me to feel strongly called to teach.
So you've kind of already started talking about the second question, and that really is, what was your vision for teaching like? You know, what did you think it would be like?
What I thought it was going to be like, it was definitely different than I thought it was going to be. It was harder than I thought it was going to be, certainly during my first couple of years. But I think my initial vision was, as I said, a little abstract, that I viewed my students as students who needed my help, that they needed, how should I say, that they had deficits that I could help close, and those were primarily academic and pretty easy to measure with pen and paper. That's not where my vision stayed, but that's what I initially thought, and I really, and I was good at that. I was good at, you know, getting the scores I needed at the end of the year and whatnot. But I started to see that that wasn't really enough, or that wasn't the whole picture.
So talk about, it sounds like to me that you learned a lot from the students.
Absolutely.
So will you give us a few details and ideas about some of the things that they taught you that really transformed your teaching?
Well, I think when I emerged from the kind of stressful haze of the first year of teaching, I could really start to see my students as whole people. And they taught me a lot about the strengths that they already had and they brought to the table. That they had so much going on, and so many strengths and so many abilities and so much character and personality and identity, and that there was so much great and strong things going on, and we were focusing, or I was focusing on the one of the things that that was lagging based on how we were choosing to measure it. Mm-hmm. And they just showed me themselves, and they showed me what they wanted and needed, that I was able to learn about their personalities, that I was able to learn about them as individuals. I think I always cared passionately about education, but I cared about it abstractly at first, that there was this, social justice issue, and I was going to be a part of the kind of imminent revolution to change it. And I started to care much more individually about my students because I started to see them. I started to see their strengths and their abilities, and I started to see that what their development meant and what their holistic, healthy, comprehensive development meant was a lot broader than their academics, and particularly a lot broader than how those academics might be measured at the end of the year test. And so I started to get curious about what it would look like to have a more contextual and comprehensive approach to education.
How did that realization impact the way that you taught going forward?
That's a great question. I think one of the primary ways that it changed how I taught was that I had an academics on top of behavior, or academics on top of everything else approach that we needed to behave in order to learn, or that we needed whatever we needed to do. It was all in service of learning, and it was all intrinsic, or I should say, sorry, it was all instrumental. And then what I started to realize is there were lots of areas of development, and if I broadened my lens, there were lots of areas of development and lots of areas of strength that I could call on, and that I could have my students involved in sharing their strengths and also guiding their own learning towards the things that they wanted to learn. Mm-hmm. And which of course increased motivation, because who wants to learn what they don't want to learn? But it also allowed them to grow and see their growth in so many other ways, and see the inherent strengths, not just the areas they needed to grow, but see their strengths in other ways. So we would, do, identity development time, and we would have, emotional skill development, and we would spend time on things that I originally didn't think merited the time. But as I got a broader, more comprehensive view of education, I realized that yes, we need to spend time on personal identity development and cultural identity development. And yes, we need to build social connections intentionally and have structures and time to support that. We need to build emotional skills intentionally and to have structures and time to support that, and not just hope that all those other things happen in pursuit of 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication.
As you think about this conference, right, the Eradicating the Odds, what would you draw from what you've shared with us and your experiences that would help all of the amazing educators and activists participating?
I think about my experience, and I'm hesitant to share and say that I have some knowledge from on high, but I think, or anything like that. But I think one thing that I have learned is that we need to take a breath and step back to have a broader approach and a broader scope of education, and understanding that it's not just narrowly academics, but it's so many areas of development that run in parallel and are mutually reinforcing, and that broader scope allows us to see strengths in our students rather than just academic deficits. That there's so much richness that can be brought out that our students bring to the table, and there's so many other areas of development that are essential for their holistic development, but also for their academic development. That if we can broaden the lens, and I think in order to broaden the lens, we have to get some space, or I like to say kind of structured slack, that our education system is so urgent, and it's, what's happening this week, what can I do to change something on Monday, what can I do to get scores by the end of the month, by the end of the week, by the end of the year. And that urgency doesn't allow the time for a more spacious view of education. That if we can take intentional space, we can create not only a broader view of education, but we can also create a greater understanding of equity. Because so often educators that I speak with, are, of course, passionate about seeing justice done and liberation and equity, but 98% of their time is concerned with their lesson plan and their grading and the thing that needs to happen next week. So cultivating space and cultivating breadth, so that we can start to have a broader vision of ourselves as educators, that we're just not cogs in a wheel, or yeah, I think that was the right thing, and of our students as full humans with identities that they bring to the table and strengths that they bring to the table. So that spaciousness is something that I tend to preach.
I'll just ask you one more question, if you don't mind. So what you're calling for is really critically important at this moment in time in terms of equality in education and equity in education. So once you came to the realization that this is what you needed to do, how did you prepare yourself?
How did I prepare myself to, in a sense, pursue a kind of broader vision of
That's
education?
exactly right. That included the equity, included the emotional learning, social emotional learning, that included the humanizing of children.
Well, I mean, I began to try to do it in small ways at the school I was at the time. So, we're going to have mindfulness classes with students. We're going to have conversations with teachers about equity. We're going to do little things without necessarily a big cosmic vision for what it was, to just get to explore and see what it was and then kind of explore this new way of seeing education. I found that wasn't necessarily a fit at the school I was at. So I got to change settings and have a broader perspective. But I think beginning to try things, and then I feel like that allowed me to develop a really coherent vision for what I wanted to do, which was trying to answer the question, what would it look like if we built students' social, emotional, behavioral, physical, mental health, identity, personal identity, cultural identity, those areas of development with the same compassionate and capacity building lens that we built academics, rather than thinking those things just need to get done or skipped over to get to academics. What would it look like to have an education system that tried to build capacity in all those areas and recognize the capacity that was already there? And I think that guiding question has been very helpful in the years since I left the classroom to help me see, what does it look like to help create an education system that looks like that?
And to our conference attendees, I am certain that the remainder of the conference will allow you to think through many of the encouragements and examples that Frank has provided. And as you go out through the next few days of the conference, really think about and ask questions about how do you become capable in these kinds of areas that you're talking about. Before we go, I'll just ask if there's one example you would like to share, because I know someone's going to ask. Would there be an example that he can share that will help us to really grow in these areas?
An example of,
One of the things that you did that you think really exhibited your ability to practice in these areas, right? I appreciate that you always share that you don't feel there's perfection or that, you know, that you don't want to share something down, but you believe in the practice of teaching. So it's always about growing and learning.
I think one thing that's very practical that I found helpful when I was in the classroom, coaching teachers, and now as a consultant, is allowing teachers to take one of the things they do best, which is planning and backwards planning and identifying a skill that a student might need to build, like, you know, 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication. And teachers are great at identifying, oh, this is why they missed that test or this question on the test. Here are the component skills of that. Which of those need to be practiced? How can I have structured support to practice those? And having that lens and framework and applying backwards planning to social emotional skills or other areas. That if there's a problem behavior or a frustration with a student, trying to step and see what's the skill that could be built. What are the component parts? Say empathy. There's so many component parts of empathy, or quality communication, or collaborative work. What are the component skills? Which could be developed more, and what would be a structured practice or a scaffolded support to help students develop that? Just take that same academic lens and flip it to other areas. That teachers are really gifted in that. They just need to be given the freedom and I think inspiration to see it that way.
And I think that's how we will end this conversation, is really throughout the next days of the conference, think about the practice of freedom and the practice of teaching as freedoms. Ask questions, ask for examples, seek collaborators, and do your best to really kind of modify your teaching so that you are responsive to children in a humanizing way, in the way that Frank just described. Thank you so much for being willing to share your teaching practices with us.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So now that you've seen Frank's conversation and interview, I know you're ready to ask him some very excellent questions. So Frank, I want to welcome Barbara, Melanie, Elizabeth, Dave, Haley, Nathaniel, Christina, Samantra, Jim, to the conversation. Thank you all for joining us. I hope I didn't miss anyone. So let's start with any questions you all might have for Frank. The chat room is open for that. I'm assuming since we're in Zoom, you can also speak to us. But Frank, now that we've played the video and people are preparing the questions that they would like to ask, any thoughts from you?
My first thought was that it wasn't as uncomfortable watching myself do a video as I thought it was going to be. Yeah, that I'm excited to be here. I've loved the conference, loved all the speakers. I'm honored to be a part of it. And that I do think finding ways that we can create space to get out of the urgent mindset of short-term academic gains first and only, and have the freedom to think about students as whole people and allow them to pursue their own freedom. We need space to do that, and we need to cultivate that space. So I'm excited to have that conversation.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, so all the questions should come through the chat. So please type in your questions. I've just been notified of that. So please type in your questions so that we can get a conversation going with Frank. So Frank, while people are entering their questions, you of course are quite well known across the city for your work with social emotional learning. So as you've done that kind of work and participated in that space, anything you would like to add to the video conversation that really centers that part of your work?
Well, I think the two things to share about the work that I try to do with schools and organizations around SEL that are relevant here. One of my big passions, and I got to have a great conversation with Dr. Hargrave, who leads the SEED office at SCS yesterday about this, was helping schools and districts adopt a systematic approach to school-wide social emotional learning. so often I see schools have what I tend to call a random acts of SEL approach, where, you know, we got this, we're adopting this curriculum, we soften the language in our discipline referral form, and we have a social worker 1 extra day a week. And like, those are all good things. But if we compare it to academics, you wouldn't say, oh, we've got this kind of reading program we do, we've got 1 extra reading interventionist, that there's a more systematic way that we think about approaching academics, that we should think about SEL in that same way. That I kind of think about it with the foundations of our, you know, having a vision, having your adults be healthy and have the right mindset and capacities, and then different pillars of, you know, supportive classroom practices and cultural responsiveness and anti-racism, that you have explicit development of social emotional skills, multi-tiered systems of support, and community partnerships, that you have this whole picture and trying to help schools think about it in that way. And I think the other key thing to be said, that were said, you know, much more eloquently than I could by certainly by Dr. Simmons yesterday, and by our keynote today, we also referenced it, which is the idea that liberation and wellness work have to go hand in hand. That liberation work is exhausting and hard to push against oppressive systems, and we need to take care of ourselves to do that work, as the Audre Lorde quote says, that, you know, self-care, taking care of myself, is an act of liberation. At the same time, if we do SEL work without liberation work, I don't think there's a better way of expressing it than it's white supremacy with a hug, but that what we want SEL to do is not train students to be more calm and compliant while we are oppressing them, but to give them the tools they need to fight for their liberation.
Related to that, we know that many teachers enter the field with a deep degree of idealism, and you talked about that as a little bit of your entry point as well. Can you help our participants to think about how you were able to, you talked a little bit about this, so I don't mean to be redundant, but how you were able to get past that, and how you would see helping other new teachers get past that, or coming and not entering with it at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think both the not entering with it at all, and then also the how we get past it. I think a lot of the ways that we seek to attract teachers to the field, or at least ways that I'm exposed to, that try to attract teachers to the field, do so with a deficit-centric savior mentality. That they're these poor, impoverished schools, and you can come help them. And you're going to be just, you know, changing lives and, you know, writing social justice issues, and that's an attractive pitch, and I know why people make it, but it sets people up to come in thinking they're going to do those things, and to come in with a deficit mindset. It's a more nuanced and complicated pitch to say, hey, as part of an oppressive system, come and join with students, and how about you all work together towards your collective liberation, while you're also, you know, trying to teach them 4th grade math or whatever it is. And that's more complicated, but I think once you understand, it's actually more attractive. And I think that how we move beyond that in our practice, I mean, for me, part of it was just getting kicked in the teeth of, you know, first year teaching. I thought I was going to be great at it, and I came in and it was really hard, and I was really struggled, and it made me take a step back. And I think all first year teachers experience failure. I don't know any first year teacher who doesn't experience some version or type of failure, or multiple types of failure. And for some people, that may be some of the first times they've experienced it. And I think the supporters and coaches in their lives can utilize that failure to help them shift perspectives, rather than just try to utilize it to improve short-term practice. And I think if we view educators as professionals in a long game to be agents of liberation, of their own liberation of, and participatory liberation with students, then we can respond to early teachers' failures in ways that help them see, like, yeah, you thought you were going to come here and change things. What are you learning from your students? The exact type of questions you asked me, I wish someone had asked me those questions during or after my first or second year teaching.
That's great. That's great. All right. I am looking at the chat box and I don't see any questions from our participants, but I know you have some. So I'm going to give you a little time to construct and enter your question, or I will go on and on with Frank. That's the kind of curiosity I have about his work and the way he approaches his work, because he's so thoughtful and reflective about it. But I will give you a moment to enter any questions that you might have. While they're doing that, Frank, would you think a little bit about when you were doing the work that you were doing and coming to the realizations that you would have coming to and shifting your work? Did you have colleagues who were also, I would say, maybe experimenting or attempting to be on a journey toward that work that you could work with?
I mean, yes. I don't know if I had anyone I was running in parallel with, but at the school I was in, which I was in a traditional no excuses charter school, and a no excuses turnaround. I mean, all of those type of things that I've since come to see as being plagued with problems, if not inherently, then certainly circumstantially. That there were lots of levels of frustration. And saw a lot of people, whether it was opting out of the teaching profession or saying, oh, I need to go teach somewhere else, or I want to work with students, but not in this way, that that maybe I'm more hard-headed, or that I stuck around for a long time seeing like, what does it look like to try to do it in this way, and just running into roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. No, I think it was lonelier than I wish it had been. I wish there'd been a group of folks that I could have sat down with and say, yeah, we wish we could see our students as whole people. I want to create time and spaces and structures for building their social emotional capacities alongside their academic capacities. And it was lonely. I feel like there are more of those structures and more of those conversations happening now. I've been fortunate enough to facilitate some of them. And so I'm grateful for that.
Very good. So we did have a great question come in. I'm going to read it verbatim because I don't want to mess it up. It's really powerful. It says, is there a problem in not agreeing that the system is oppressive, but the system itself offers liberation for those who choose to seek it?
That's a really interesting question.
I'm glad you're answering it.
I wish, yeah. I'll just turn it back on you. Is there a problem? And I'll do the decoding work that I taught my fifth graders to do, and not agreeing the system is oppressive. Yeah, that's where I thought you were headed with the liberation through education. And I think that's absolutely what we want. I think it's important that we define what liberation means and looks like. I believe that it was Gloria Ladson-Billings who talked about that. I'm gonna paraphrase because it's the best I can do. I can't come up with the exact quote, but she said that we don't want to help people do a better job of getting to the top of an unjust pyramid. We want to turn the pyramid into a circle. And I think that there is, if we're talking about liberation as in economic opportunity and social advancement through education, that's a narrative that has existed and been true for a long time, and there's certainly truth to it. I think there are other types of liberation, and I think there's a question of what do we ask students to sacrifice in order to gain, whether it, success at a no excuses charter school, that will help them get to college. What are they giving up? And what are we asking a Black or brown child to give up that we're not asking a white child to get that same access? So I think we absolutely need to send the message, and I think educators do send the message, that education provides a great opportunity. Education exists within a system that's inequitable, that our education system was designed both as a segregated system that then was just made unsegregated without systematic changes, and was also designed as a system that got a few people to college and then made the rest kind of factory workers or other things. And then we just changed the goalpost that everyone's supposed to get to college right now, and now we're equitable, but we haven't made the systematic changes to get different outcomes. So we're surprised that we're still getting just some people going to college as inequitable outcomes. So that was scattershot of hitting part of your question, but I think, yes, there is great opportunity that can come through education. We need to think about the cost of that and how we can make it truly accessible without asking students to give up their personal and cultural identity in order to achieve success in a narrow model. What does it mean to widen the model of success?
Thank you for that.
Please, Dave, if there's got a follow-up, ask it, because I don't know what kind of response that was.
Dave, we welcome your follow-up to that, as well as to anyone wanting to insert another question. Let me see. Frank, as you were talking, I kept reflecting on how all the speakers have talked about humanity. So we've had, and I know we will have it this afternoon. So really all the three keynotes, that's a big part of their work in education. I'm just wondering, as you were listening to the two that we've already had, how that intersected with your own work and thinking in that area.
I mean, I just wanted to keep, saying amen to both the speakers, and just because it's like, oh, those are things I believe, but that just captures it so much more succinctly and clearly than I could have stated. But I do think recognizing the full humanity of students is hugely important. I remember, I don't know if this is on topic, but I remember when I was first starting teaching, and I did the Memphis teacher residency program, which I loved. And I believe it was someone in that program who was just reiterating, like, you don't have kids yet, you don't really understand and get it. I remember as a first year teacher, 22, 23, kind of slightly resentful of it. What do you mean? Like, what do you mean I don't have access to this knowledge and whatnot? But then once I had a son, when I was a school administrator, I realized it did change. That I started to think, what kind of school do I want my child to go to? I want his whole humanity to be there. Like, if he's got big feelings, I want those. If he's having hard conversations, I want those to be supported. Yes, I want him to excel academically, but the distinction between the narrowness with which I was pursuing academic achievement for the students under my purview at the time, and how I would want it pursued for my son, made me really start to question what I was doing. Because it was admittedly I recognized that it was easier for me to see the full humanity of my son than it was for me to see the full humanity of my students. And that really made me take a step back and recognize that how would I approach education if I saw the full humanity of my students in the way that I see the full humanity or try to see the full humanity of my son?
That's a powerful idea, and I think it's one we've grappled with over the years in education. That in fact, this idea of othering, right? That some educators might not be able to see the humanity in their children because they see them as this kind of other type of a human who doesn't deserve it, who hasn't earned it and all of that, whereas in their own children, they would want nothing less than the absolute best for them and for people to consistently see the humanity in them. So I think that's something we really do have to think about a bit more, is how do we help educators shift from seeing the students as the other? A lot of work to be done.
Well, I mean, I think our system, the kind of industrial model of education, encourages us to see them that way, because we don't currently have, with the, the amount of standards that have to be taught, the length of the school day, the number of students in a classroom, you don't have the time and space to see each of your students, or it can feel overwhelming with all the other demands to see your students as full people, because it just to take care of their academic needs feels like too much. And then you're adding their, social emotional needs and behavioral needs and their identity needs and their physical needs. And, this is where you hear the comment from teachers, which I think is completely valid. They're like, well, don't ask me to be a therapist while you're also asking me to be a math teacher. And I get that, which is why I think the foundation of SEL work has to be adult emotional capacity and culture. Because, to quote the cliche, you can't pour from an empty cup. The image when I do a training on adult emotional health for teachers is the image of, one socket with 30 plugs plugged into it. And that's what teachers can feel like. So we have to focus on teachers first for them to be able to see the whole humanity of students. But we also need to recognize that the system's not set up for us to see the whole humanity of students. That when we're asking teachers to do that, we're asking them to fight against a system that wants you to see students either by their test score or by their academic potential or by how well they did on this test. We're going to group, these 5 students are the ones that are excelling. Here are my 12 bubble students. Here are my 8 students who aren't going to make it. And I'm just going to put them on the computer while I focus on my bubble students to get them up here. That the structures and outcomes desired by the education system, because it's industrial, don't encourage full humanity.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have, maybe they gave us the 5 minutes message. So we have about 4 minutes. So I'm just going to give our wonderful attendees. We have about a dozen people with us today, Frank. Any chance for a last minute question? And then I'll allow Frank a little wrap up time. All right, Frank, we have a couple of minutes left. Anything you want to say just as a kind of wrap up?
I think the only thing I may not have touched on that I do like to talk about is the nature of school-wide SEL. I'm not sure what roles and responsibilities all the people who are with us today have, but one thing that I see so often in schools who are well-intentioned trying to approach SEL, that they pass that work off to it's the behavior specialist, the counselor, the social worker, whoever that person is in that building, or some combination of them, the assistant principal, whoever in charge of discipline. And when you put the responsibility for SEL in the hands of the people who spend all of their time dealing with the 10 to 15% of students with the greatest behavioral need, the tier 2 and tier 3 students, then the solutions that are going to be created are ones that are student facing and focusing on that tier of students, which means that you leave all the adults, all of the parents, and all of the tier 1 students out of SEL solutions, simply because they're not on fire. And so I always encourage schools, and when I work with schools and their principal says, I'll send you my social worker and you can work. I was like, no. I'm going to need a principal. I'm going to need a couple teachers, and now I'll take your social worker too. Because if it's not whole school, you're going to keep having the same issues. So I just say, that we can keep putting out fires, or we can step back and do some fire prevention and get some new wiring in the house so it stops having so many fires. And that's what tier 1 is. And it's hard to say that when they're active fires. But we have to do both. There has to be a reactive part of SEL that helps deal with students who are having, very strong feelings and reactions and behaviors that are not conducive to the rest of the community's learning. And we have to have a closely guarded proactive area, because things aren't ever going to get better if we're just responding to problems. So that's why it has to be school-wide and it has to be proactive. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone taking the time. Always great to talk with you, Dr. Cross. And I can, if anyone's interested in following up, I can put my email in the chat. So if you have any questions or are interested in what I do, feel free to reach out and shoot me an email.
Thank you, Frank, so much. And thank you to the participants for this session for joining us. Thank you, Dave. Thank you for joining us. Now you get to go to the movement room featuring Zumba and mindful meditations, I understand. So to leave this session, you could just hit the leave button when you're ready, and then use your Expo Pass then to enter into your mindfulness and a Zumba. And then you can also go to the journal and reflection room, where you can capture some of your time and then rejoin for the rest of the conference today. Thank you all. It was a pleasure to have you with us. And thank you, Frank, for your transparency, your humbleness, and for being willing to share with us your growth experience.
Thank you.